Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. On today's episode, I am joined by Susan Barker to chat about her latest novel, Old Soul, a haunting and mesmerising story that weaves across continents and centuries with a terrifying anti-hero at its heart. This is a story perfect for fans of Margaret Atwood, Julia Armfield and Stephen King, and it's out now and published by Penguin Fig Tree. Susan Barker is a British-Malaysian novelist based in Manchester, where she's a senior lecturer in creative writing at Manchester Metropolitan University. Susan is the author of 4 books. Her third novel, The Incarnations, was a New York Times Editor's Choice and notable book. A Kirkus Review's Top 10 Book of the Year, was shortlisted for the Kirkus Prize for Fiction, and was the winner of a Jerwood Fiction Uncovered Prize. An excerpt from her latest novel, Old Soul, won a Northern Writers Award for Fiction in 2020, and here to discuss it, welcome Susan to A Pair of Bookends.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to have you. I'm really excited to chat to you. And before we get into your book, I have to ask you my favourite bookish question, which is, what are you currently reading?
Right, so I've just finished a book called Anti Shall Appear by Kate Van de Borg, show you there,
Yeah.
which is, I think it's dark academia slash gothic horror, and it's about a young man from a town in the north, and he goes to Cambridge to study music, and he's from quite a modest background, state school educated, so he feels quite out of place amongst all these privileged southerners who are quite oblivious to their privilege, and he falls under the sway of this posh guy called Bryn, who he's kind of like an amateur magician, but he has a lot of other students under his sway, and this nameless character, the protagonist, falls under his sway as well. And there's this ambiguity as to whether his magic's real or just all illusory and sleight of hand. And yeah, I found it a really gripping and enthralling read. And it's also really interesting on class and just how you're really in the main character's shoes as he's trying to navigate this new environment where most of the other students have a kind of economic, social and cultural capital that he lacks, and sort of move around with a lot more ease. So yeah, it's really
That sounds
enjoyable on a lot of
great.
different levels. Yeah, it's really good.
I love stories that explore class,
Yeah,
and
same.
my friend Emma, who I believe you know as well.
Yes, I read The Knowing for a book group last year and we all really enjoyed it. And she came and had a chat with us as well. So we had a lot of questions for her.
Yeah, she
Yeah, it's
said
really fun.
she was very excited when I said that I was going to be talking to you. She was like, "Oh, I know Susan," and she was a big advocate for the book that you mentioned. Is it "And He Shall Appear"? Is that?
And he shall appear. I think it
Yeah.
comes from that expression, speak of the devil and he shall appear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sounds great. That's 2 people that have told me to read it now, so.
Yes.
But let's get into your book, Old Soul, which was my introduction to your work. So before we chat about it, I would love to know, what are the books and authors that you feel have influenced your work?
Right, yes. So I started writing fiction in the early 2000s when I was living in Japan. I was in a small town outside Kyoto and teaching English there. It was the early 2000s. We didn't have internet in I lived in just a small studio flat, and so there's no internet, no television. I spent most evenings reading novels and attempting to write fiction myself. And I think two authors that were really pivotal for me around that time and sort of shaped the writer that I am. The first is David Mitchell. I read Number Nine Dream and Ghost Written around that time. And yeah, I just found them both really entertaining and exhilarating. And I love the way he mixed up genres and styles and voices. And yeah, it was something I just really wanted to emulate in my own writing. Another author is Haruki Murakami. I think I read Wind Up Bird Chronicle and Norwegian Wood. And I think I really loved the sense of another reality existing beyond our reality. Like his
Mm.
books always have these like really strong metaphysical elements. So yeah, again, that was a big influence as well. So yeah, they're 2 sort of key writers when I started off in my career. Well, it wasn't even a career then. It was just sort of me trying to write stories. But yeah, I don't know. I think I learned something from every book I read, even if
Yeah.
it's not a book that I particularly love. Like I still learn something about craft. I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment called Come Closer by Sarah Gran, published in the early
I feel like
2003,
I
I
feel like
think.
another author has mentioned this book, but I can't think
Yeah,
who.
it's published well over 20 years ago, but I think it's having kind of a renaissance. But it's about this woman that thinks she's possessed, and it's fantastic. And I'm just, as I'm reading it, I'm learning a lot about suspense and drip feeding these sinister details. It's really fun.
And speaking of suspense, your book genuinely terrified me. I think it's
Oh,
the first time, and I always find it very strange with how I am with books in comparison to how I am with TV and film,
mm,
because it's the same thing with things making me cry, in that I can cry a lot at TV and film, but it takes a
hmm,
lot for a book to make me cry. And
right.
it's quite rare for that to happen, but
Hmm,
it's happened with, with fear as well, is that I've not really, I mean, I don't read a lot of horror anyway, so that's probably why a book hasn't really made me scared yet. But this is just genuinely, it made me so scared. And it's not a jump scare sort of book, is it?
hmm,
It's very much like things are very unsettling, and you don't know what's around the corner, and you don't know what
hmm,
somebody's going to do. And I think that is more unsettling and scary than actually, a very kind of obvious jump scare or obvious kind of monster. Do you know
hmm.
what I mean? It's like, oh no,
Yeah.
somebody that lives among us is much more
Hmm.
scarier. um,
Yeah.
and I will ask you about that sort of fear element in a moment, but I wanted to know if you could tell the listeners what the initial inspiration was for this book.
So this Old Soul's the first novel I've written that's explicitly been a horror novel. I've always loved horror. Some of my earliest childhood memories of watching Hammer horrors that my dad had taped onto his Betamax tapes the night before, and being 5 years old and being really scared and fascinated and intrigued by what was going on screen. And obviously, as I got older, I got into more video nasty sort of horrors and sort of Nightmare on Elm Street and all the films we see as a rite of passage in our teenage years. And yeah, the supernatural's just always been deeply fascinating to me. And in my previous three books, there have been elements of the supernatural. There's been characters that think they see or communicate with ghosts, but it's always been ambiguous as to whether it's in the character's head or not. But those were the parts that I really enjoyed writing the most, kind of inventing beyond reality and trying to create that atmosphere of fear and suspense for the reader. So I think with Old Soul, I just went for it and decided to make it explicitly a horror. I think one of the key inspirations when I first started writing the book in 2015 was this horror film called It Follows, which is written and directed by David Robert Mitchell. Have you seen it?
I've not, no.
No. Okay, so it's about this group of teenagers, and there's a sexually transmitted curse that moves amongst them. And when you have the curse, you're stalked to death by this entity that just walks after you at this slow pace, but gets to you eventually. So you can keep running, but it will come for you. And Old Soul's very different from that, but I think it follows. It renewed my appreciation of horror because it didn't just operate on the level of frightening the viewer. There was also like really interesting, nuanced characterization, and it was visually quite stunning. But yeah, it gave me the idea of an inescapable curse that sort of terrorizes the holder of the curse to death. Yeah, so that's a key influence. And I also reread some classic horrors like Dracula and The Haunting of Hill House and The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a big influence on Old Soul because it's about immortality and sustaining immortality
Mhm.
through artistic means, which is, yeah,
That
lots of
that
resonance
film
there.
that film sounds absolutely terrifying to me.
Yeah, I've seen it several times and I feel sad that I can never recapture the feeling of dread I felt when I first saw it in the cinema. Like I sat down and the opening sequence is so terrifying and I feel sad that I know what's going to happen. Like I'm
Oh,
expecting the jump scares and yeah, it's still fantastic.
my boyfriend's very into horror and watches a ton of horror films, and he's almost definitely seen that. There's very few that he hasn't seen. He
Hmm.
he likes going to find like the foreign language horror films, and he
Right.
likes, he wants to find, the ones that aren't even in the mainstream. That he basically wants to find something that's genuinely going to scare him, and he's scared by very little, which absolutely
Oh.
baffles me. But that sounds like my worst fear because I've the nightmares that I've had throughout my life. If I'm being chased, it's a weird thing that I've got where I just fall to the floor. If I'm being chased in a nightmare, I just fall to the floor. I can't run, and it's just
Oh.
like it's like a freeze response.
Right, yeah. I mean, I have like yeah, that sounds absolutely terrifying to have that sort of recurring nightmare. I have recurring nightmares very frequently about either being in my childhood home and there's a poltergeist there and it's kind of like pursuing me and I also have like sleep paralysis sort of nightmares where I there's
Yeah.
an entity or presence at the end of my bed or even in bed with me and
Oh
I
my
can't
God.
seem to move and get up.
Do you know,
Yeah,
I
it's
had sleep paralysis when I was at university, and I had it really bad there, but it was never an entity in the room, thankfully.
mhm.
It was
Yeah.
always that I would just wake up and not be able to open my eyes and not be able to speak, or I felt like I couldn't breathe. It felt like there was a weight on my chest, but I couldn't open my eyes, I couldn't move, I couldn't do anything, and I just had to wait it out until I could actually get up. And it was horrific, but I hear
Yeah.
so many stories of people seeing an entity, and oh, it freaks me out.
Right, yeah, yeah. I mean, the fear is very real, I
Very
think.
real.
Yeah, it's as if you're in a life or death situation,
Yeah.
I think, in real life.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I wasn't
yeah.
expecting us to get onto this, but I love
Yeah.
it. So let's talk about the novel. It not only moves across the globe, but it also travels across a huge period of time. And I was curious how much plotting had to go into that.
Well, Old Soul took me 8 years to write, and I definitely didn't sit down at the start of those 8 years and come up with a plot and a plan and a structure. I had a vague idea that it would be different testimonies told from the perspective of the victims, and the testimonies would sort of come together like puzzle pieces and give like a complete picture of this woman and her modus operandi. And then I sort of like intersperse the testimonies with a narrative that takes place over 24 hours and it follows the woman and her latest victim as this 17-year-old girl called Rosa as they're walking into the Badlands of New Mexico, which is like this stark, desolate wilderness. They're the only people there. And I think, yeah, maybe the structure's quite basic, but I feel as though the plotting like evolved over the 8 years. And each testimony also is like a short story in itself and has
Yeah.
a kind of a similar sort of narrative arc, but a lot of the plot and characterization is really different. And obviously the historical era. So yeah, I think maybe the hardest thing was each testimony leads to the next one because there's this character Jake who's gathering the testimonies and there's always a little clue or a hint in one testimony that leads him to the person in the next. And it was sort of like how to bring those, but yeah, link every testimony so he can sort of like move back in time almost.
I loved the way that you wrote the various testimonies because, like you said, they read almost like a short story in themselves,
Mhm.
and you get through one of them, and you think surely, surely nobody can experience anything worse than this, and then
Right,
as you go
yeah.
along, it just gets more and more unsettling. I really loved that you had this sort of testimony plot. I was curious which of those voices came to you first, and I also wanted to know which of the testimonies you maybe enjoyed writing the most.
Right, yeah. Which came to me first? Gosh, I can't remember.
I mean, it has been 8 years, so
I
that's fair enough.
yeah, it's been 8 years. I think maybe Jake and Mariko were they set the ball rolling. Like
Yes, yeah.
they both missed the same flight and they spend the evening together at Mariko's hotel and there they discover this coincidence and they both lost loved ones who crossed paths with the same woman and yeah, so maybe they came first. Of the seven testimonies, I think I wouldn't say enjoyed, but one testimony that came to me in like almost I wrote it in a trance over 2 weeks, was the bedwear one. I think it's the third testimony, and Jake visits this old man in rural Wales, and he talks about what happened in the 80s. He had a daughter who was a wheelchair user, and the woman enters their lives, and then it's almost like what follows in the aftermath is also almost like possession horror, but something about his voice and like he's a very oppressive, abusive
Yeah.
kind of person. And I
Hmm.
mean, I think Old Soul's about different kinds of horror. There's the supernatural horror, but there's also human horrors
Yeah.
where people are in oppressive relationships or live in an oppressive, authoritarian totalitarian state, as in like the testimony set in the former Eastern Bloc. But yeah, I don't know, something about that, like his voice sort of took hold of me. I
Yeah.
felt as though I was channeling, almost like expressing something true that I believed about this certain type of oppressive relationship. And another testimony that came to me really easily was Theo's testimony. That's the testimony 7, the final one. And Theo she's a sculptor who left New York in the early 80s to go and live in Taos County, a really remote rural area. She's inspired by artists like Agnes Martin and Georgia O'Keeffe to just go and live in a small hut and just focus entirely on making art. And her voice is very sardonic and sarcastic, and but also self-deprecating, and she's the only character that really gets to know the woman. And yeah, I wrote her first in third person, and it was okay, not she wasn't really coming to life on the page. And then I switched to like a diary format, and her voice again, it's amazing when a character's voice sort of like takes hold, and it's almost like you're channeling from something that already exists.
One of the things that I want to talk to you about is setting, because just with us running through the testimonies, then so much was coming to mind about how setting is such a huge feature in horror, and how that can almost be the oppressive part of it, and that can almost make things even more unsettling. So, that there's the father that lives with his daughter, and they have this kind of controlling relationship, I suppose. And of course, because she's a wheelchair user, she maybe relies on him to assist her with certain things, which maybe lends itself to a feeling of being trapped with him. And he's very controlling in the sense that he doesn't really like her having her friends over and all that kind of stuff. But their house in this rural part of Wales, like you said, is also kind of out of the way of people, and it lends itself to that feeling of trapped again. And then also, I think on the opposite side of that, we have the initial meeting with Jake, and it's Mariko, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. They meet in the airport, and there's something about being in such a busy space but having this like really intense kind of moment with somebody. But yeah, there's so many moments about like the final testimony that you just mentioned. I'm trying to keep it spoiler free with the things that I'm speaking about, so it's hard. But the final testimony, at the end, she kind of lives in this sort of secluded place.
Theo.
Yes.
Yes.
And yeah, I wondered, I can't really talk about the final meeting without it spoiling anything, and I don't want to do that.
I think it's okay to say that the woman and Theo, they form a kind of, the woman sort of moves through the world without any meaningful human connection, but Theo's
Yes.
the first character that she forms a connection with and
Yes.
feels for.
And is it safe to say that she returns to see her with her family, or is that too much of a spoiler?
That's okay.
That's a spoiler.
Yeah. No, it's okay. It's fine. You can keep it in.
But I wondered if you could speak about the different settings that you've used, and the relationship that kind of had to the horror of the story.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I chose the settings for different reasons. Sometimes I chose them out of nostalgia. Like there's a testimony set in Kyoto, Japan. I taught English there, obviously, and
Okay.
just wanted to spend time there again. There's a section set in New York, Lower East Side in the 80s, and I lived in the States in the late 90s. I had this summer job at the Statue of Liberty selling hot dogs and yogurt in
Oh my
frozen
gosh.
yogurt, or yogurt as they say, in a kiosk on Liberty Island. And I spent a lot of time like hanging around there in CBGB, so I obviously wanted to set something
Yes.
there. And other settings I was drawn to, I guess because I wanted to learn more about them. I didn't know a huge amount about the history of the former Eastern Bloc, and so I decided to have a setting set in Leipzig during the GDR, and in Budapest in the late 50s, obviously when Hungary was a communist country, and just sort of write about the sort of human horrors of living in an oppressive political state alongside the supernatural horrors. So yeah, the different horrors sort of amplify each other, I think, and both feel equally inescapable. And then the Badlands section. So all of the testimonies are interspersed with these short chapters set in the Bisbee Badlands, and it's the woman and the 17-year-old girl called Rosa. And
That's actually the main one I should have mentioned. I have
I
that
mean,
written down. Is
that
that?
I've never been there, but like they're staggeringly beautiful. It's this wilderness of stone, basically. It's dating back to the Cretaceous era, so it's about 75 million years old, and it's been differentially eroded by wind and rain over centuries. So to make these staggeringly beautiful rock formations, hoodoos and long spires and boulders. And I wanted to set something there because the woman's really acutely aware of the fleetingness of just her own life, but also the human species. We've been here for what, 200,000 years? It's not much in the grand scheme of life on Earth. I think the dinosaurs were like 200 million years, so they're gonna probably, have a much longer span than us, the way we're going. So yeah, just I think like having her walking in that environment really hammers home the point that we're not here for a very long time, and it sort of is part of her justification for doing what she does to sustain her life and her survival.
Yeah, and I think that's a good time to talk about immortality, which is the reason why she's visiting these various people, is because she wants to be able to live forever, essentially. And I don't know how best to describe it. Is it that she like latches onto these various people, and I don't what is
So
a way to describe it without spoiling anything? I mean,
I think it's okay to say that she is someone in servitude to a higher power who guides her about and guides her to her next victim, and she enters their life. She's very much a dark empath, so she can see what people need to feel validated and seen, and she
yes.
gives it to them. Obviously, she's guided a lot of quite marginalized people as well.
And I
Yeah.
think, it's leaning into these vulnerabilities, and
Hmm.
she literally captures these vulnerabilities. She takes a photo, and
Yeah.
the point is that she takes a photo of them, and then they have to see it, and
Yeah.
that's how this sort of curse is carried out. But I think I found it unsettling. Death is something that makes me incredibly anxious, and
Yeah.
I don't like thinking about it. And it's something that comes to us all. So I don't know why it's something that makes me so anxious, but it always has done. But I also don't know how I feel about being immortal either.
Mm.
It doesn't really sound appealing, especially after reading this book. What are your feelings on immortality? Would you take that same opportunity? Obviously, not wanting to latch onto people and do awful things, but if you had the opportunity, would you take it?
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm really scared of aging and death as well. I mean, I started to write Old Soul when I was in my mid to late 30s, and it was an age that I started to become aware of aging and death in a way I hadn't before. I know it's a cliche, but in my 20s, I truly felt invincible. I didn't, I thought death was something that happens to other people.
Yeah.
And yeah, I became more acutely aware of it. And obviously, I channeled that fear into Old Soul. I think it's the motive force of the book, this fear of death. Would I want to be immortal though? I don't know. No, probably not. I think it would be very lonely.
Yeah.
I mean, because you're like a outlier of the human race, you'd have to do what the woman does, which is just move through the world by yourself because you don't want other people to know.
Yeah.
And like everyone you love will predecease you.
Yeah.
And then you'll find new people to love and they'd predecease you as well. So it would be a kind of a lonely existence. And I think what makes life meaningful is its brevity. I
Yeah.
know we all take it for granted sometimes, but when you fall in love with someone, that's the love of your life, or you just have a few loves rather than like an infinite number. So
Yeah.
so the brevity makes things more significant and meaningful, I think.
That's so
So
true.
yeah.
And I think my curiosity would mean that I do have a curiosity of like what's the future like, or what
Mm,
has the past been like, before and after me, like what could happen in terms of the world, in terms of people I care about, and their great grandchildren or whatever. I'd want to see the kind of family line out of curiosity.
yeah.
But like you said, it would be a very lonely place to be because you probably wouldn't be able to stick around the same people, and you'd also probably get a bit bored.
Yeah, you may become jaded,
Yeah.
and just world weary and bored. Yeah, yeah, and also, I mean, the future of humanity could potentially be devastating. I hope
Yes.
not, but
Oh,
there
there's
could be.
potential there.
Yeah, yeah.
It's, yeah, frightening stuff. But let's talk about fear actually, because
Hmm.
as I said before, I found it really unsettling, and I read before bed, and this probably wasn't the best book for me to read before
Hmm.
bed. I was curious about how you go about building that tension in your writing and, yeah, evoking that fear in your reader.
Hmm. So there's this great book by Stephen King called Dance Macabre, and in it he just talks about horror and how it works, but he differentiates between the three different emotions that horror can evoke in the reader, and he orders them as well. So he says the first is terror, which is the suspense and dread before the
Hmm.
monster appears. You know, when you have those, Noel Carroll, another horror theorist, describes as the onset of the monster. Like there's these ambiguous signs in the environment, something's not quite right. And Stephen King says terror is the most refined of the emotions. Then he says there's horror when the monster does appear and there's a confrontation, and horror is that visceral shock fear when the monster appears. And then there's disgust, which is like the gross out, the sort of the splattering blood and the eyeball popping out and stuff like that. And he says that's the least refined, but has a place. And I think with Old Soul, I my hope was to operate in the realm of terror, the suspense in each testimony where the central character realizes something bad has happened to their loved one. They come home from a night out and their face looks different in a way they can't really put their finger on. Something feels uncanny and Heimlich, or they see their friends lying down in the night and there's a sudden movement in their stomach that doesn't seem physiological. It's like there's something in there, but then they're like, oh, but maybe I just imagined it was just a split second thing. And I think those smaller signs of the onset of the supernatural are
Mm.
the scariest moments. I don't know. I don't know what scared you about Old Soul, but
No,
for
I
me
think
that was what I was
I think for sure those moments of kind of not knowing what is going on with a person, it's like you can feel something's happening and something's changing, but
mm,
you can't put your finger on it. And I think it's the kind of the unknown. You can really tell that I'm somebody that deals with anxiety because the unknown absolutely terrifies me.
right, same.
But
The
yeah, they
uncertainty of things, I think.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was those moments of, they're noticing something different about like somebody they know very well and they can't put their finger on it. And, there's the movement in the stomach that you described, like, yeah, just very, very strange. And I've recently become a bit obsessed with watching, there's a section of TikTok that talks about like haunted houses or whatever, and it's found its way
Oh.
onto my For You page. But somebody had spoken about seeing their boyfriend. And I know some people will be like, oh, this is a load of rubbish, whatever. But I've been with people when they've seen a ghost before. So I think I'm kind of open to believing in this stuff. I know some people aren't, that's fine. But this woman had described moving into a new house, and she was unpacking the car and she turned round and seen her boyfriend in the window. And when she'd gone in the house, he wasn't there. Like he was in the back of the house upstairs, and there's no way that he would have moved upstairs that quickly. And then she spoke about hearing like scrabbling in her ensuite bathroom. Like she'd woke up hearing that sound and had been like, oh, the dog's locked in the bathroom, and then realised the dog was at the end of her feet. And it was just all these little strange things. And then I
Mhm.
was reading about mimics, and it's where you see somebody you love or you hear your own voice and somebody trying to talk to you, and that just absolutely terrifies me. And I don't know if it's true, but I'm quite open to believing in that kind of thing. And yeah, I think it reminded me of that kind of fear of, especially when it's seeing somebody you know and love, and it's not just a random kind of entity, it's actually a
Yeah.
person that you've got a relationship with and you trust and love,
Yeah.
and then seeing something different in them. And that is what I found unsettling about Old Soul, especially, there's I think this is the one that's in Japan, where it's the dad of the child, and he's,
Mhm.
and he like dances naked on the roof, and he just starts, his
Yeah.
behavior is just very strange and removed to
Mhm.
what his wife, knows him to be like. And his child starts recognizing the differences. And I think that moments like that are the things that really freak me out.
Right, yeah, someone that you love and trust.
Yeah,
I know their marriage was a bit rocky, but she did fundamentally know who he was. To
yeah,
to suddenly change and become almost like a doppelganger of their former self. I mean, I think it plays with a fear we have about truly knowing other people.
yes,
And a lot of possession horror, I think it plays on the fear of our inevitable aging and death, and the fear of losing control of your body and your
yeah,
mind, like it becoming estranged from your yourself. But yeah, the story you told about your friend and the apparition of her boyfriend in the car window, I love that stuff. I could just listen to it all night. It's so interesting to me.
It's fascinating, but it absolutely
Yeah.
terrifies me. I wanted to know as well if there were any books that, obviously, I mentioned that Old Soul is the first book
Mhm.
to really scare me, and I wondered if there were any books that have made you feel that type of fear.
So I think I was most scared of the stuff I read when I was in my adolescence. I was a big
Okay.
Stephen King fan, of course, and Salem's Lot, his short stories like Night Shift and Skeleton Crew would really make me too scared to like just go to the toilet in the night. I was so terrified. And I think it's because when you're a child, you're a bit more transliminal in that
Yes.
the boundaries between your mental world and reality are more porous. So, you can read something, it's bouncing around in your imagination and it shapes your perception of what you see. And yeah, I kind of miss that in a way. Like I think as you become older, you learn to rationalize and explain things away with
Yeah.
logic. And so yeah, I'm less scared. I do get spooked, creeped out, but not to the extent I was when I was a kid, where I really believed that there'd be rain tapping on my window was a vampire from Salem's Lot or whatever. One book I read that freaked me out as an adult was House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski.
I haven't come across this.
Okay, it's like a doorstop. It's a tome. It's about, and it's very sort of like, I don't know. It was published in the early 2000s, and I think it was like a postmodern kind of horror book. But the main story is about a man who's a photographer. He moves into this house of the suburbs of this city with his family, two kids and a wife. And it's like a big new build, I think. And the dimensions of the house like really slowly and subtly change around them. One day they're measuring the house and they realize that the inside of the house is larger than the outside. And they'll put up some shelves and then a gap will open up between the shelf and the wall when their back's turned. So it's very creepy in that way. And I just moved into a new flat in Leeds when I was reading it, an empty flat, no furniture. And the book, again, like the book infiltrated my imagination and
Yes.
I was just being creeped out by this flat. And
Yeah,
I'm thinking, wasn't
understandably
that door
so.
there? Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's completely understandable. I think I would be the same. I
Mm.
mean, that sounds great, and I don't know how much horror I will go on to read, because it's not a genre that I've massively delved into. I mean, I only read my first Stephen King last year. I read
Oh, which
Carrie last
one?
year.
Oh,
Carrie,
classic.
yeah, and I thought it was probably the best place to start because that was his debut, wasn't it? And just incredible that was his debut. I'm definitely open to reading more by him, and I would like to try more in this genre, but I think because I'm just such an inherently anxious person, stuff
Right. I
like
mean,
that.
I actually find I'm an anxious person as well, and I actually really enjoy going to see a horror film because I feel it helps me sort of like exercise some of that,
Yeah,
exorcise
that's
some of
such a
that
good point.
anxiety. Because you go into the film and like I saw Alien Romulus recently. It is
Yes,
so
very
much
good.
fun.
Yes.
There's so many jump scares in it.
Yeah.
And I was just in the cinema, and you go through these cycles of like tension and
Yes.
anxiety, but what's going on screen, and then there's the jump scare, the monster appears, and then you feel like this release. And I think it's
Mm.
neurochemical as well. There's like a dopamine kind of release with it as well. So I think I like horror because it's sort of all of my free floating anxieties kind of have an outlet for it.
That's a very valid point. Maybe I should watch
Yeah,
more
I mean,
horror.
but everyone's different, I think.
No, I think I definitely need to be more open to it, and it's a very valid point. I'm going to link in the show notes a brilliant article that you wrote for crimereads.com called Why We Need Monstrous Women. And one of the things that you know in this article is that there aren't many female monsters in the horror genre. And I was curious why you think that might be.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, when I was writing the article, I could only think of about half a dozen. You've got Sadeko and from The Ring, Asami from Audition. You've got Kathy Bates' character in Misery, I forget her name, and Pearl in the X trilogy. Yeah, there aren't too many. I'm not sure. Maybe it's because a female monster's maybe less threatening than a male one. I'm not sure. I mean, women in horror films are generally a victim or the
Yes.
plucky, resourceful final girl. And for me, I think when I was writing Old Soul, originally she was a man for the first
Interesting.
draft of the book. Yeah, she was a man who painted people's portraits, as I mentioned, very picture of Dorian Gray
Yes.
inspired. And it wasn't quite working. The character wasn't really coming to life on the page. And then I flipped the gender and I understood her and her motivations a lot better. And as I say in the essay, I think centering a horror around a female monster is really interesting because I think a female monster is seen as more of an aberration of nature, by
Mm,
which I mean a conventionally feminine nature, which is supposed to be maternal and nurturing and empathetic and kind. And I think a female monster, obviously, I don't condone what my main protagonist slash antagonist does in the book, but she does reject all of these values. It's really what she represents, which is a rejection of all these values that women are held up to and
mm.
judged in accordance to. So,
Yeah,
so
and
yeah.
I think the interesting thing as well, and I think you explored this in the essay, but how much women have to kind of suppress or repress. There's a lot of great TV and films that have explored that kind of
Mhm.
female rage. It's something that you've got to kind of push down or, not engage with. And female rage can be for a number of things. And I think, that women are often seen as like the mother figure or the maternal figure. There's a lot of kind of stereotypes of women. So I think, reading a female monster is unnerving because it moves away from that. It allows for all these emotions that we often don't engage with to kind of come to the surface and be sort of times by, I don't know, 100. And yeah,
Mhm.
I found that really unsettling about the woman in your book is that, she, like you said, she just allowed herself to be that way, and she wasn't kind of holding back. There was nothing holding her back.
Yeah.
She was gonna do what she set out to do, and nobody was gonna kind of stop her, and she didn't have that
Yeah.
same sort of sympathy or empathy that might retract the average woman.
Yeah, I mean, there's different kinds of female monsters. There's the unhinged kind,
Yes.
like Pearl in the X trilogy, who just really goes for it, with the axe at the end. And then you have the more calculating kind, a bit like Italy in Under the Skin, which is a novel by Michelle Faber. And I think my antagonist is more the calculating kind.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, there are moments of rage, and I think she exteriorizes a lot of stuff that we keep inside, like the unfairness of having to like suppress your wants and desires and to be
Mm,
people pleasing and likable and all of those things. Like, yeah, I mean, I don't condone what she does. I
no.
think I would call her evil, but I
Yes.
mean, there's something I admire about her, about the way she moves through the world, and she doesn't care about conforming or fitting in, and she doesn't care what anyone thinks of her either. And I quite
Exactly.
like that. I wish I
Yeah,
was more like that.
me too. Just without all the evil.
Yeah.
The main takeaway of this episode is that I think listeners really need to read this book, and thank you for writing it.
Thank you for having me on to talk about it.
No, of course. My last thing that I always end on is to ask for a recommendation. Now, you've already given a lot of recommendations today, so I don't know if there's any left. But is there anything, an all-time favorite book or anything great that you've read this year that you'd like to recommend?
Does it have to be books?
Actually,
Can
it
it
can
be a
be TV,
film?
film, anything.
Okay,
Yeah, go
cool.
for anything.
I saw a film recently called I'm Still Here. My mind has blanked on the name
Yes,
of
it
the
was that
director.
an Oscar? Was that won an Oscar, didn't it?
I think it won the Oscar for Best International Film,
Yeah.
but it's about the military dictatorship in Brazil and it's set in the early 70s. It opens in Rio de Janeiro and it follows this fairly kind of like bourgeoisie family that live by the beach and there's three daughters and a son, and the husband was an ex-congressman. And I think there was some political beef with him going back a few years, but they generally have quite a good life. And the first half of the film is just showing a happy family. And then the second half of the film, he and his wife are arrested. And yeah, it just shows the sort of fallout of the husband's disappearance. And it spans several decades. And this film really messed me up. Like I was crying for the last 45 minutes. And it's kind of about the way his wife sort of like keeps the family together and keeps going and like her resilience and drawing from these reserves of strength that she maybe didn't realize she had and yeah I just found it a really powerfully moving film. I recommend it.
I really, really want to watch this now.
Yeah.
I've seen a few people recommend it. I am not sure how I feel about crying for the last 45 minutes.
Yeah,
But
I know. That was just me. I wasn't like sobbing, I was just like quietly crying. But the friend I went to see it with, she looked a bit perplexed at the state
I
of me at the end of the
it
film.
doesn't take much to make me cry when it comes to TV
Yeah.
and film. I don't know what it is about those mediums, but yeah, I'm really excited to watch that. Excited, shouldn't say that because I'm gonna cry. But yeah, I really want to watch that. So thank you for that recommendation, and thank you for giving me so many great recommendations today. There's definitely a lot of horror for me to venture into. So thank you so much, and thank you for coming on a pair of bookends.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at a pair of bookends pod on Instagram and at a pair of bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And Susan, where can the listeners find you on social media?
I'm on Instagram. I have a really fiddly handle. It's like _Sue_K_B.
We'll pop a
So
link below.
yeah, okay, cool.
Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.